The Fall of the Tirpitz. When engineering met its match, on the morning of November 12, 1944, at precisely 8:50, Captain Sir Robert Weber positioned himself on the command bridge of the battleship Tirpitz, his eyes scanning the distant horizon. The fjord, known as Tromsø, stretched out before him in northern Norway, and the air that morning carried a biting cold along with crystalline clarity. Rising up from the water's edge, the surrounding mountains towered like massive barriers of dark stone, their peaks contrasting sharply against the washed-out sky of the Arctic region. Beneath where he stood, more than 52,600 tons of precision German engineering lay ready. This was the most massive battleship any European naval force had ever constructed. His task was straightforward: locate enemy vessels. Every preparation had been made for the possibility of naval engagement. When he studied the Citadel's steel armor plating, which measured a full 12 inches in thickness, he experienced a profound sense of invulnerability. The mathematics backing up this confidence was solid and verifiable. According to his calculations, no torpedo in existence possessed the capability to breach his protective nets. Similarly, no conventional aerial bomb had the force necessary to punch through his deck armor. Surrounding the vessel like a protective steel womb, 3 separate rows of anti-torpedo netting stood guard. Up on the cliff faces overlooking the anchorage, chemical smoke generation equipment remained staffed and operational around the clock. However, Captain Weber was committing a mistake that would prove fatal. What he failed to grasp was that the fundamental principles governing modern warfare had already undergone a dramatic transformation. While his attention remained fixed on the sea, the real danger wasn't approaching from anywhere on the horizon. Something entirely different was heading his way, something that completely disregarded every traditional rule of naval engagement. No quantity of armor plating, no matter how thick the steel, no depth of protective water could offer any defense against what was coming. In Winston Churchill's view, the Tirpitz represented nothing less than the beast. Churchill's intentions went far beyond simply wanting her destroyed. He was consumed by the idea. Over the course of 3 long years, he had composed memo after memo addressed to the Admiralty, each one carrying the identical directive. The elimination of this ship represents the most crucial objective at sea during this period. No alternative target even comes close in importance. What drove such an intense fixation on a vessel that spent most of its time anchored in port? The answer lies in the fact that the Tirpitz was actively contributing to Germany's war effort without ever discharging a single shot. Naval strategists had a specific term for her role: a fleet in being. Simply by remaining positioned in her Norwegian stronghold, she compelled the British to maintain 2 of their modern battleships, HMS King George V and HMS Anson, along with an entire fleet carrier permanently positioned at Scapa Flow, effectively paralyzed as they awaited a sortie that might never materialize. Each convoy that set sail toward Russia required heavy escort protection, which steadily drained the Royal Navy's resources. Merchant vessels were being lost at an alarming rate. Sailors met their deaths in the frigid waters of the Arctic Ocean. Throughout all of this, the Tirpitz remained stationed in her fjord, draining Allied resources through nothing more than her continued existence. She functioned as a strategic void, consuming everything around her. Captain Weber fully comprehended the power this position afforded him. His sense of security was well-founded, and he possessed every rational reason to feel that way. The fjord itself functioned as a natural fortress, one that seemed specifically designed to render traditional naval warfare tactics completely ineffective. On every side of the anchorage, mountains climbed steeply, reaching heights of 3,000 feet. This geographical reality made any conventional torpedo attack essentially impossible. Aircraft simply couldn't descend to the necessary altitude and maintain sufficient speed to release their weapons before crashing directly into the surrounding rock faces. The waters surrounding the ship formed an elaborate maze of defensive obstacles. Encircling the hull were 3 distinct rows of heavy steel anti-torpedo netting. Each section of netting was weighted down with chains and firmly secured to the seabed below. Any torpedo that somehow managed to penetrate into the fjord would become entangled in this mesh barrier long before it could reach the ship itself. Meanwhile, positioned on the cliffs high above, chemical smoke generation equipment remained manned continuously, day and night. The German operational procedures were both rigorous and thoroughly practiced. Within just 7 minutes of receiving a radar warning, the generators would begin pumping out sufficient quantities of chlorosulfonic acid smoke to smother the entire fjord in a fog so dense that visibility would become impossible. The logic was simple. If visual contact with the ship cannot be established, then accurate targeting becomes impossible. But the ultimate line of defense lay in the armor plating itself. The Bismarck-class design philosophy placed survivability considerations above every other priority. The Citadel, essentially an armored box constructed to protect the engines and ammunition storage, was encased in Wotan Weich and Wotan Hart steel, which represented the pinnacle of German metallurgical achievement. The main armor belt exceeded 12 inches in thickness. The deck armor possessed the capability to deflect anything dropped from high altitude. For the German sailors who called the Tirpitz home, she represented more than just a ship. She was a steel-plated guarantee that they would survive. To truly grasp why the ultimate attack represented such a revolutionary change in warfare, you need to understand the history of failed attempts that came before. The first of these failures turned into a claustrophobic nightmare. In September of 1943, an operation codenamed Source was launched. The British Admiralty had come to the realization that striking the Tirpitz from the air was simply not feasible. The anti-aircraft fire was too intense, the smokescreen deployment too rapid, and the fjord itself too constricted. Their solution was to attack from below the surface. They developed what they called the X-craft. These were submarines in the technical sense, but barely. They measured just 50 feet from bow to stern, and only 5 feet across at their widest point. To describe them as merely small would be an understatement. They were essentially steel coffins. The 4-man crew assigned to each vessel existed in a space so cramped that standing upright was impossible. Stretching out was out of the question, and there was no escaping the persistent odors of diesel fuel, accumulated body sweat, and decomposing provisions. The air recycling system was rudimentary at best. After spending 24 hours beneath the surface, the crew members would find themselves breathing air heavily contaminated with their own exhaled carbon dioxide, which would cause their thinking to become clouded and their decision-making abilities to deteriorate. By any reasonable assessment, the mission they were undertaking bordered on insanity. The X-craft needed to be towed more than 1,000 miles across the stormy North Sea by larger submarines, then detach from their tow lines, navigate their way through extensive minefields, cut through 3 separate layers of steel netting, and position 2 tons of amatol explosive directly beneath the Tirpitz's keel. The calculated probability of mission success stood at less than 10%. The likelihood of the crew's surviving was even more remote. 6 X-craft departed from Scotland on their mission. X-9 suffered a broken tow rope during a severe storm and disappeared into the depths along with all 4 crew members. There was no distress signal transmitted, no wreckage ever recovered. The submarine simply ceased to exist. X-8 developed catastrophic leaking problems and had to be deliberately sunk by her own crew, who were pulled from the freezing water half dead from hypothermia. Only 3 submarines successfully reached the target area. X-6 was under the command of Lieutenant Donald Cameron, who was just 23 years old at the time. By the time he navigated into the outer fjord, his periscope had been shattered. His gyroscopic compass had ceased functioning. His depth gauge was providing unreliable readings. He was navigating blind through enemy-controlled waters, relying on nothing more than dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse through a damaged lens. At 7:07 in the morning on September 22nd, he collided with something solid. He raised what remained of his functioning periscope and discovered he was positioned so close to the Tirpitz that his view consisted of German sailors on the deck above, casually disposing of their breakfast leftovers into the water below. He had successfully penetrated through the innermost protective net. At that moment, his engine ceased operating. The X-6 broke the surface directly adjacent to the battleship. German sailors on deck spotted the unusual vessel and immediately began firing at it with rifles and grenades. Cameron maintained his composure. He understood clearly that his fate would be either death or capture. He put the submarine into one final dive, deliberately crashing it onto the seabed directly beneath the Tirpitz's main turret, which was designated César. He activated the timer on his 2 side-mounted charges, setting it for 1 hour. Then he opened the hatches, deliberately scuttled the submarine, and surrendered to the Germans. For the next 60 minutes, Cameron and his crew sat as prisoners on the deck of the Tirpitz, repeatedly checking their watches. The German officers conducted interrogations, demanding information about what actions they had taken. Cameron maintained complete silence. His only focus was watching the second-hand advance around the clock face. At 8:12 in the morning, the water beneath the ship violently erupted. The explosion was enormous in scale. It lifted the entire 52,000-ton battleship approximately 5 feet straight up into the air. Crew members were hurled off their feet throughout the ship. The electrical lighting systems failed completely. The massive 15-inch gun turrets, each one weighing more than 1,000 tons, were jolted violently off their roller mechanisms. Electrical systems throughout the ship experienced short circuits. The ship took on approximately 1,400 tons of water through ruptured seams in the hull. From a tactical standpoint, it was an absolutely brilliant success. Cameron would eventually be awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. But the Tirpitz remained afloat. The double-bottom hull construction held firm. The armored citadel stayed structurally intact. German damage control teams, working in freezing water that rose to their waists, managed to reinforce the bulkheads and bring the flooding under control. Within a period of 6 months, the beast had been fully repaired and was once again operational. The lesson learned was a bitter one to accept. Conventional explosive charges, even when 2 tons of them were detonated at point-blank range, proved incapable of overwhelming German engineering excellence. Standing on the bridge, Weber reviewed the damage assessment report. The explosion had lifted 50,000 tons of steel, approximately 5 feet, into the air. It had destroyed delicate instrumentation, knocked out electrical systems throughout the vessel, and resulted in the deaths of several men stationed below decks. The cost of repairs would be substantial. The ship would remain out of active service for several months. However, the hull remained intact. Weber permitted himself a cold, satisfied smile. He had felt the force of the explosion transmitted through the deck plates beneath his feet. He had witnessed the chaos that followed, heard the screaming of his wounded men, and yet here he stood on a ship that continued to float, remained fully armed, and was still a dangerous threat. If 2 tons of explosives detonated directly beneath the keel couldn't manage to sink the Tirpitz, what possibly could? To his way of thinking, this wasn't a near-death experience at all. It was definitive proof. It proved that German engineering was superior to British courage and determination. It proved that the Tirpitz was precisely what her designers had guaranteed she would be: unsinkable. By April of 1944, the Tirpitz had returned to full operational status. The threat she represented had returned in full force. The Royal Navy made the decision to abandon subtle tactics altogether. They opted for overwhelming brute force instead. Operation Tungsten was organized on a scale comparable to D-Day, except the entire effort was directed at a single ship. The strike force included 2 fleet carriers, HMS Victorious and HMS Furious. 4 additional escort carriers joined them, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers. They assembled a strike force consisting of 42 Fairey Barracuda dive bombers, which would be escorted by 80 fighter aircraft. This was a swarm specifically designed to overwhelm every defensive measure. At dawn on April 3rd, they caught the German defenders completely unprepared. The smoke generators were activated too late to be effective. The fjord remained clearly visible. The Barracudas plummeted downward in nearly vertical diving attacks, releasing their bombs at the absolute last possible moment. 1 strike connected, then 2, then 5. In total, 15 bombs smashed into the Tirpitz in less than 60 seconds of sustained attack. Pilots returning from the mission reported seeing their weapons striking home, witnessing the flashes of impact, and observing smoke rising from the damaged vessel. The scene that unfolded on the deck was nothing short of a massacre. The bombs completely shredded the unarmored superstructure. The bridge and surrounding superstructure were transformed into mangled metal wreckage. Anti-aircraft gun crews were completely wiped out at their battle stations. 122 German sailors were killed instantaneously. More than 300 others sustained injuries. From an aerial perspective, it appeared to be a total and complete victory. The ship was engulfed in flames from bow to stern. However, when the reconnaissance photographs were developed and returned for analysis, the British intelligence analysts felt their hearts sink. The Tirpitz was still floating in a perfectly level position. Not even a single degree of list was visible. What explained this? The answer was physics. The Barracudas were carrying 1,600-pound armor-piercing bombs, which were serious weapons specifically engineered to penetrate warship deck armor. However, because of the low cloud ceiling hanging over the fjord, they were forced to release their bombs from below 3,000 feet altitude. For a bomb to build up sufficient velocity, it requires adequate altitude during its fall. When dropped from that relatively low height, the weapons impacted the deck traveling at only 500 miles per hour. That velocity proved insufficient for penetration. They struck against the main armored deck, which consisted of 4 inches of hardened Wotan steel, and simply disintegrated upon impact. Some bombs actually bounced off the surface. Others detonated at the moment of impact, spraying deadly fragments that killed crew members but proved incapable of penetrating through to the citadel located below. They succeeded in destroying radar arrays, completely wrecked the galley facilities, and turned the medical sickbay into a charnel house. But they failed to damage the engines. They failed to damage the ammunition magazines. They failed to damage anything that was truly critical to the ship's combat capability. The beast had shrugged off 15 direct bomb hits as though they were nothing more than hailstones. Weber walked through the smoke-filled corridors of his burning ship. The smell assaulting his senses was overwhelming, a mixture of cordite, burning paint, and something far worse. He stepped over the bodies of dead sailors, passed by weeping wounded men, and moved through compartments that had been transformed into slaughterhouses. 122 of his men had lost their lives. The upper decks appeared as though they had been struck by an earthquake. However, as he made his way down to the main armored deck level, the truth became apparent. The British bombs had left scars on the steel surface. Some of the welded seams had developed cracks. There were visible dents and gouges marking the locations where weapons had struck, but they hadn't achieved penetration. Not a single bomb had managed to break through to the machinery spaces located below. Not one engine had sustained damage. Not one boiler had been ruptured. The ammunition magazines remained dry and structurally intact. The heart of the beast continued beating. He transmitted a signal to Berlin with a simple message. Ship remains operational. Repairs currently underway. Standing there amid the smoke and chaos surrounding him, Weber experienced something unusual. It wasn't fear that he felt, but rather confirmation of his beliefs. The Allies had thrown everything available at him, submarines, dive bombers, massed air attacks, and yet he remained here, alive. He felt more convinced than ever before of one thing. They could scratch the paint coating his ship. They could kill his men, certainly, but they couldn't kill his ship. The Admiralty had run out of conventional ideas. The Navy's attempts had failed. The conventional Air Force's efforts had failed. The time had come to bring in the unconventional thinkers, the mad scientists. This is where Barnes-Wallace enters the story. He wasn't a military officer by training. He was an engineer, the brilliant mind who had designed the bouncing bombs employed by the Dam Busters Squadron to destroy the Ruhr dams. He examined the Tirpitz not as a ship that needed to be sunk, but rather as a physics problem that required solving. His solution was nothing short of radical. His theoretical approach was elegantly simple. If breaking through the armor from above proves impossible, then destroy the material supporting it from underneath. Water and soil share a property. They're incompressible substances. When you detonate a massive explosive charge deep underground or underwater, the resulting shock wave travels both faster and hits with greater force than it would traveling through air. This creates what engineers refer to as a camouflage, a massive vacuum bubble that expands outward in all directions and then violently collapses inward. When this collapse occurs, it eliminates the foundation entirely. The target doesn't simply break apart, it literally falls into a void that didn't exist a second earlier. To accomplish this objective, Wallace constructed something monstrous. He gave it the name Tall Boy. This was far from being a normal bomb in any conventional sense. It was a precision-crafted instrument specifically designed for geological violence. Its length measured 21 feet, and its weight reached 12,000 pounds, nearly 6 tons in total mass. Most bombs manufactured during that era consisted of cast-iron casings filled with inexpensive explosive compounds. The Tall Boy was fundamentally different from these. Its casing was constructed from a single piece of high-tensile steel, machined to the same precision tolerances one would find in a naval gun barrel. Why was this level of precision necessary? Because the weapon had to survive the impact of hitting the ground at Mach 1, 750 miles per hour, without shattering into pieces. A standard bomb would disintegrate completely upon such an impact. The tall boy was specifically engineered to bury itself 30 feet into the earth before its detonation sequence activated. The explosive compound contained inside was Torpex, which delivered 50% more destructive power than TNT, but the manufacturing process wasn't as simple as just pouring it in. If any air bubbles existed within the explosive mixture, the shock of impact would cause the bomb to detonate prematurely before it could achieve its intended penetration depth. Therefore, the factories filled the tall boys while they were positioned upside down, pouring the molten explosive material drop by drop over a period of several days, allowing each layer to settle completely and cure before the next layer was added. The production of each individual bomb required weeks of careful manufacturing, and the tail assembly, the tail was where the real secret lay. The stabilizing fins were angled precisely 5 degrees off the central axis. This design feature forced the bomb to spin as it fell through the air, much like a rifle bullet spinning as it leaves the barrel. A standard bomb tends to wobble during its descent, drift off course, and lose accuracy. The tall boy drilled through the atmosphere with gyroscopic stability that kept it on target. Drop it from an altitude of 18,000 feet, and it would impact the ground within the area of a tennis court from the intended aiming point. The British had successfully constructed their hammer. What they needed now was someone with enough courage, or perhaps insanity, to swing it. In September of 1944, Operation Paravane was launched. The Tirpitz had been relocated to Kafjord in the extreme north of Norway, well beyond the Arctic Circle. The distance was simply too great for a Lancaster bomber carrying a 6-ton bomb to fly from England and return safely. The mathematics of fuel consumption and range made it impossible. Consequently, the RAF made a decision that terrified the air crews even more than the prospect of facing German defenses. The plan was to fly all the way to Russia. The elite No. 9 and No. 617 squadrons, the legendary Dam Busters, took off with 38 Lancaster bombers, each one carrying a single tall boy weapon. They weren't headed to a modern airbase equipped with concrete runways and proper support facilities. Their destination was Yagodnik, which was little more than a muddy strip of grass located near Arkhangelsk in the Soviet Union. The flight itself turned into a navigational disaster. The maps they were using contained serious errors. Soviet cartography was decades out of date and unreliable. The radio equipment proved useless due to the magnetic interference characteristic of Arctic regions. They flew through freezing rain that coated the aircraft wings in dangerous layers of ice, forcing pilots to repeatedly climb and dive in attempts to shake off the accumulation. 6 aircraft were forced to make crash landings in the Russian taiga wilderness. Their crews wandered lost through the swamps for days before Soviet patrols finally located them. When the surviving aircraft finally arrived at Yagodnik, they discovered conditions that were primitively nightmarish. The mud was so deep and thick that the heavy bombers sank down to their wheel axles. The Soviet fuel trucks were operated by hand pumps, and the fuel quality was contaminated with impurities. The food provided was completely unidentifiable. The latrine facilities consisted of nothing more than holes dug in the ground. However, they had achieved one crucial objective. They were now within striking range. On September 15th, they launched their attack. Weber's smoke generation systems functioned perfectly as designed. Within mere minutes, the fjord completely vanished beneath a blanket of dense white chemical fog. The British bombardiers found themselves dropping their weapons blind, essentially guessing where the ship might be located based on the pattern of anti-aircraft fire bursts rising up through the smoke layer. The majority of bombs missed their target by hundreds of yards. However, one tall boy succeeded in finding its mark. It didn't impact the deck directly. Instead, it struck the water near the bow section and continued traveling downward. The bomb dove beneath the water surface, curved underneath the hull structure, and detonated against the seabed below. The resulting shockwave was absolutely catastrophic in its effects. It whipped the entire 52,000-ton ship violently, like a bedsheet snapping in a strong wind. The bow section was crushed by the force. Bulkheads throughout the forward sections ruptured. The massive propeller shafts were knocked completely off their mounting brackets. The Tirpitz didn't sink immediately, but she was fundamentally broken. Her engines were destroyed beyond any hope of repair. She would never again sail under her own power. The Germans made what would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Berlin issued orders to tow the crippled battleship south to Tromsø. The reasoning appeared sound on paper. They would utilize her as a stationary floating artillery battery. Her massive 15-inch guns would provide coastal defense firepower against any potential Allied landing operations in Norway. She might no longer be capable of sailing, but she retained her ability to fight. They dredged a sandbank to position beneath her keel. The strategic logic seemed straightforward enough. Even if she were to sink, she would simply settle onto the sandbank and continue operating her guns. The water depth was shallow enough that her deck levels would remain above the surface. They believed they were making her unsinkable by the very definition of the concept. Weber informed his officers with confidence. Quote 1. He genuinely believed these words. After surviving everything thrown at them, the submarines, the dive bombers, the tall boys, he remained alive, and his ship still posed a dangerous threat. The laws of physics appeared to be aligned on his side. Before we continue with the final chapter of this story, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this video from right now? Let us know in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these historical stories reach across the globe. What he failed to understand was that he had just positioned his ship directly on top of what amounted to a geological trap, and he failed to realize that by relocating south, he had brought the Tirpitz 200 miles closer to Scotland. He had reduced the distance just enough to make what was about to happen possible. The victim had walked directly into the executioner's effective range. November 12, 1944, marked the day of Operation Catechism. This would be the final act. There would be no more flights to Russia required. The target now fell within operational range from Scotland. Just barely, but the margins were tight. To successfully carry 12,000 pounds of bomb load across that distance, the Lancaster bombers had to be stripped down to absolute bare essentials. The mechanics removed the mid-upper gun turrets completely. They removed all the armor plating that had been installed to protect the crew members. They removed the de-icing equipment that normally prevented the wings from icing over at high altitude. These aircraft were no longer properly equipped warplanes. They had been transformed into essentially flying fuel tanks with a massive bomb suspended underneath. If a German fighter aircraft intercepted them, they would be completely defenseless and doomed. If the weather conditions deteriorated significantly, they would be doomed. Every crew member understood the odds they were facing. They climbed aboard their aircraft anyway. 32 Lancaster bombers took off at 3 o'clock in the morning into the freezing darkness. At 8 o'clock in the morning, German radar stations detected the incoming formation. The alarm klaxons screamed across the turpits with urgent intensity. "Smoke! Generate smoke immediately!" This defensive measure had successfully saved them every single time before. The crew sprinted to reach the generation equipment. Valves were opened quickly. The acid began flowing into the burner units. White smoke started rising from the cliff faces surrounding the fjord. However, nature decided to intervene in an unexpected way. There was absolutely no wind that morning. Not even a breath of air moved across the water's surface. The smoke failed to spread horizontally, as it normally would. It simply hung suspended in place, forming a low white blanket that covered the water surface but left the masts and superstructure of the turpits protruding above it like a perfect target marker, pointing directly at the ship. At an altitude of 14,000 feet, the lead bombardier peered through his SABS sight, the stabilized automatic bomb sight, which was essentially an analog computer constructed of precision gears and lenses that calculated factors like wind drift, altitude, and terminal velocity. Below his position, through gaps and breaks in the smoke coverage, he could clearly see the dark shape of the battleship. The aiming point was perfectly clear and visible. The German 15-inch main battery guns opened fire in response. They weren't shooting at surface ships, obviously. Instead, they were firing main battery shells, fused to detonate at altitude, attempting to knock the bombers out of the sky through blast effects alone. The sky surrounding the Lancaster Formation filled with black explosive bursts. The aircraft bucked and shuddered violently in the turbulent air, but the pilots of 617 Squadron maintained straight and level flight. They had a name for this final approach: the Dead Man's Run. During the final 60 seconds of any bomb run, deviation of any kind is impossible. You cannot dodge defensive fire. You cannot flinch away from danger. You must fly in a perfectly straight line to allow the mathematical calculations to function correctly. Quote, 3 here came the call, followed by silence. A tall boy requires nearly 30 seconds to fall from that altitude to the target. That's 30 seconds spent watching, waiting, and hoping the aim was true. At 8:41 in the morning, the first tall boy missed the ship itself by approximately 30 feet, but it struck the sandbank directly alongside the hull. This is the precise moment where Weber's defensive plan died completely. The earthquake effect performed exactly what Barnes-Wallis had designed it to accomplish. The bomb buried itself deep into the sand before detonating. The shockwave instantly liquefied the sandbank, the same sandbank the turpits had been resting upon for support. The solid ground that was supposed to make her unsinkable transformed into quicksand in a fraction of a second. The ship lost all foundational support beneath her. Then came the direct hits that sealed her fate. 2 tallboy bombs struck the port side of the hull directly. They punched completely through the armored deck, the same Wotan steel that had successfully stopped 15 bombs back in April, as if it were nothing more than wet cardboard. They didn't detonate upon contact with the deck. Instead, they buried themselves deep within the bowels of the ship, penetrating down next to the ammunition magazines before their detonation sequences activated. The violence that followed is extremely difficult to adequately describe in words. Imagine a 12,000-pound explosion occurring inside what is essentially a steel box. The pressure generated had absolutely nowhere to go except through the structural framework of the ship itself. Turret Caesar, the exact same turret that Lieutenant Cameron had attempted to destroy with his X-craft a full year earlier, was blown completely out of the ship in one piece. This structure, weighing 700 tons, roughly the equivalent weight of a small warship, was thrown into the air and landed in the water approximately 20 meters away from the hull. The Tirpitz began her death roll. The liquefied sandbank offered absolutely no resistance to the movement. The flooded compartments caused a dramatic shift in the center of gravity. The list reached 20 degrees, then 40 degrees. Inside the ship, the darkness became absolutely total. The electrical systems had been completely destroyed in the explosions. The screaming sound of twisting, tearing metal was even louder than the screaming voices of dying men. At a 60-degree list, ammunition began spilling from the loading hoists, crashing down through compartments and killing men who had somehow survived the initial blast. At 8:52 in the morning, just 11 minutes after the first bomb had fallen, the lonely Queen of the North capsized completely. She rolled a full 180 degrees. The massive superstructure buried itself deep in the mud of the fjord bottom. The red anti-fouling paint covering her keel rose up into the cold Arctic air, exposed to the sky for the first and last time. Silence returned to settle over the fjord. The aftermath proved grim and haunting. 971 German sailors lost their lives. Rescue workers standing on the upturned hull could hear survivors tapping desperately on the inside of the steel plates for days afterward. They cut holes using acetylene torches and managed to extract 87 men who were still alive. The remaining trapped sailors either suffocated or froze to death in the darkness, caught in air pockets that slowly depleted their oxygen supply. Captain Weber went down with his ship, as tradition demanded. He had maintained his belief that his ship was safe, precisely because it was so incredibly strong. He had survived submarine attacks. He had survived dive bomber assaults. He had even survived tall boy attacks previously. He had executed everything correctly according to the rules of naval warfare as he understood and practiced them. However, the fundamental rules had undergone a change that he never fully grasped. The sinking of the Tirpitz delivered the final, undeniable proof of a new reality in modern warfare. Germany had constructed the ultimate expression of old-style warfare, a ship equipped with thicker armor, larger guns, and more steel than any European vessel that had been built before her. The Allies had responded with the new style of warfare, industrial precision manufacturing, applied physics principles, and aerospace engineering capabilities. When you find yourself fighting against an industrial power that possesses the ability to transform the very earth beneath your feet into a weapon system, no fortress proves strong enough to withstand the assault. If you found this story compelling and historically fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We don't simply tell isolated stories of heroism for entertainment value. We conduct thorough analysis of the systems, technologies, and strategic decisions that actually determined the outcome of the war. Let us know in the comments section below what you think. Do you believe the Tirpitz could have survived if she had remained positioned in the deep fjords of the far north? Or was the tallboy weapon always going to find a way to destroy her eventually, regardless of location? For more stories exploring how technological advancement defeated traditional military tactics, check out the video we've linked here on your screen.